Please be seated. So this gospel that Susan just read, it's one of the many gospel passages that actually can be found in Luke and in Matthew and Mark. It's one of the passages that we read as part of the Sundays after the Epiphany, every 3 years. So maybe some of you have heard it before. But whether it's familiar or not, I don't know if we can fully appreciate the tension, the drama, and the impact of Jesus' words that we hear today. We sit as part of our worship, we sit in this comfortable, beautiful space. We sit perhaps familiar with these words. Can we, though, really imagine what it was like in that synagogue over 2,000 years ago? I want to help you get some sense of it. I want to help you engage the moment with your head and your heart. And I want to invite you to experience it by listening to these words.
Let me make one final plea, Mr. President. Millions have put their trust in you. And as you told the nation yesterday, you have felt the providential hand of a loving God. In the name of our God, I ask you to have mercy upon the people in our country who are scared now. There are gay, lesbian, and transgender children in Democratic, Republican, and independent families, some who fear for their lives. And the people who pick our crops and clean our office buildings, who labor in poultry farms and meat packing plants, who wash the dishes after we eat in restaurants and work the night shifts in hospitals, they may not be citizens or have the proper documentation, but the vast majority of immigrants are not criminals. They pay taxes and are good neighbors. They are faithful members of our churches and mosques, synagogues, wadara, and temples. I ask you to have mercy, Mr. President, on those in our communities whose children fear that their parents will be taken away, and that you help those who are fleeing war zones and persecution in their own lands to find compassion and welcome here. Our God teaches us that we are to be merciful to the stranger, for we were all once strangers in this land. May God grant us the strength and courage to honor the dignity of every human being, to speak the truth to one another in love, and walk humbly with each other and our God for the good of all people in this nation and the world. Amen.
Indeed, God bless her. I imagine many of you have heard these words before, perhaps even seen the clip that would cut to President Trump and his response. If not, because I know some of you are without internet and other media forums, so that was the Bishop of Washington, D.C., Marion Budde. She was preaching to President Trump and his new administration the day after his inauguration. Now maybe you get a sense of the deafening silence and the unsettled stillness of that synagogue in Nazareth some 2,000 years ago. It didn't start that way. It didn't start that way because this is Jesus' return. This is the return of a hometown boy made good. Jesus returns to Nazareth after he's been baptized, after he's endured the temptations into the wilderness. This is very early on in his ministry. It's really the launching of his ministry in some ways, of his public ministry. And we don't know much of what he's been doing, but Luke does say, well, everyone praised him. So he must have been creating a stir. So can you imagine if you have been worshiping at that synagogue year after year? Can you imagine how you would have felt when he's coming back? There might have been excitement. I remember him when he was just wee high, right? There might have been pride. He used to sit next to his dad, Joseph. He was such a good boy. There might have been curiosity. What's all this fuss about? Those would have been at least some of the emotions animating that synagogue. And let's not forget, Jesus was fully human. So I wonder what the emotions would have been for him. Maybe excitement too, and maybe some nervousness, because while Nazareth was the same town that he had left, he is no longer the same young man who left Nazareth. So imagine just the fullness of that moment as he's in the synagogue where he is worshiped time after time after time. The typical worship of a synagogue gathering was that any, and with no excuse to the patriarchy, it's true, any male could stand up and offer prayer or read. And so maybe some of them had already done that. Maybe some of the men had stood up. Maybe some had offered a prayer or something like that. Or maybe they just went right to Jesus, but they wanted to hear from him. He was the main attraction, to be sure. And so we hear that they give him the scroll from Isaiah. They want him to read. But here's the deal. In those days, the lessons weren't assigned as they are today. And so picture this. Jesus gets the scroll from Isaiah, and he's looking through it. He's looking through it. He chooses what he wants to read. Luke says, when he found the place, this is what he wants to read from Isaiah. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to release the captives and recovery of sight to the blind and to let the oppressed go free. Now maybe some of the people in the synagogue, maybe they were moved by the fact that he had read from the most powerful words of their sacred text, the most storied prophet, Isaiah. Maybe they were, but not all of them, because in that synagogue are the religious elite, are the power brokers of Nazareth, are the comfortable, are the privileged. And they would have been like, wait a sec, right? Did he choose that for me? They would have had slaves. They would have enjoyed privilege. They would have participated in a community that marginalized the poor, that judged those with any health issues as, frankly, being punished for whatever sin they had committed, that stood in the luxury of their homes thinking, well, that's because we deserved it, because God blessed us. God favors us. That would have been their thinking in that room. And then Jesus reads to them this passage from Isaiah, which historically promised a complete reversal of society, a complete reversal of power, a complete reworking of community. Historically, is he suggesting that now? And can you imagine how the air in the synagogue would have chilled a little bit? Can you imagine how those excited, proud faces would have just fallen? Is he talking to me? And Luke says that he finishes, he rolls up the scroll, he hands it back, and in what is likely the first recorded mic drop moment in history, he sits down. Silence. Silence broken by Jesus, who says, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." To that gathering, that would not have sounded like good news, that would have sounded like a threat. Very ominous stuff. And I wonder what questions were going through their minds. I wonder if they were thinking, wait a sec, do we have to sell our slaves? What? Do I have to give up some of my possessions? Am I supposed to go out into the streets, out to the margins, and like reach out to those people? Luke makes clear that the answer is yet. This is the first moment of Jesus' public ministry. This is not only his homecoming, but it is his coming out. Luke makes clear for all who have ears to hear that everything that follows from this moment on is to be in fulfillment of those words originally spoken by Isaiah. Luke makes clear to those who are reading, hearing his gospel, that the church, whatever it might be, that this Jesus movement should all be movement towards what Isaiah has just said. Can you imagine the discomfort? Can you imagine the questions for these people of privilege who sat in the synagogue? All of which leaves me wondering, so what are the questions stirring for you? Don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to jump up and shout it out. But I do want to share with you, at the very least, some of the questions that were stirring for me as I read and prayed upon these words and sat with them over the course of the week. And it has to go through these lines, and it has to go through the lens, I hasten to add, through the lens of this moment in our country. What we are going through, what we are facing, what we are enduring. And so these are the questions which came to my mind, which is, so what is the good news that I have for the poor today? What might it be? It's got to be more than, hey, we read about you today in church. And it's got to be more than a promise. It certainly has to be better than fake news. It's even got to be more than, here, I have something for you. I see you. It's got to be more than that. I think if we were to really make good news, then we have to address head on the very systems, the very structure that continue to make the poor poor. Then we have to figure out not how to participate in a widening gap between the haves and the have-nots, but how to draw that in. Whatever those structures might be, they surely have something to do with this crazy income skewed scale where the haves make so much and the laborers make so little. Whatever it might take, it surely has to address something around lending practice, something around the predatory credit card companies, something around the access to education and the educational burdens and of higher education. Has to be about that. It has to be in some way good news that not just makes promises, but invites, that shows the way of how to be lifted out of poverty. I wonder what that good news is. And then here's the other thing I got to tell you, and this is being honest, and it makes my knees tremble a little bit. But as I wonder about what the good news might be, I also wonder, so in what way might I be complicit in bad news? I got to ask that. I wonder about that, and I wonder about the captives. I wonder about the captives who are supposed to be set free. I mean, my first thought is, well, we don't have the political prisoners in our country as in Jesus' time. We don't have political prisoners here, do we? Do we? And among many things, I think about our black and brown siblings who are incarcerated at a rate so much higher than so-called whites, and incarcerated with such longer sentences, with life sentences, not to mention the death penalty. And while those might not be political prisoners, they certainly are prisoners of politics, are they not? And I think about the tomorrow that we're looking at, and the tomorrow after that, and the tomorrow after that, where ICE agents are being called to the streets, where sanctuaries such as a church or a school are being run down, all so that we can round up refugees and so-called illegals. I think about the Mississippi lawmaker who, did you see this? Who was calling for the creation of bounty hunters to find these immigrants. My God, how many more captives are we going to have in the months to come? Unless we find a way to get in there. I wonder about that, and then I wonder that shadow side. Am I complicit in supporting their captivity? There's that whole line about the recovery of sight to the blind. And my first thought was, so is he talking about the literal blind or the figurative blind? And well, yes. It calls into question, how is it that we care for those who are unwell in our country? And at the very least, at the starting point, even if we're not doctors, and some of you are, but I sure am not, it calls into question, what can I do, what can we do to make sure that that good health care is available for every person in this country, and not just a privilege of the rich? That's a way that we can at least participate a bit in the recovery of the sight to the blind. And if we're going to do it in ways more than that, then here's the other question. When are there times when we are blind to those people who are not well? Isaiah wrote about, Jesus spoke about, somehow letting the oppressed go free. Letting the oppressed go free. Letting the oppressed go free. I imagine in this country, and again, I think about those people in this country of African descent who have endured generations of oppression. And just this week, we've heard about the dismantling of affirmative action, the silencing of diversity, equity, and belonging conversations. I think about how those things will lead to oppression not only for our African American friends and members, but then for women and for our LGBTQ community. Where is there freedom from oppression in these things? I think about particularly our trans siblings who are having their very identities ignored, who are losing their laws, their privilege for everything from healthcare rights to these binary passports to just human dignity. Where is the freedom from oppression in these changes? We have to work. We have to work to make sure that oppression does not happen in our streets, in our church, in Pasadena, in our towns. We have to work to liberate the oppressed each and every day. And we have to make sure people, whatever privilege of our social location, we have to make sure that we are in no way prolonging that oppression. Look, do you get now why the people in the synagogue might have been squirming a little bit? Because I don't know about you, but me, I mean, these are hard questions. We live a relatively privileged life, and I get it if you might not want to really unpack these questions, much less really act on these questions. But here's the deal. If we really want to follow the revolutionary Jesus, if we really want to be the church that Luke was imagining and that the Spirit is calling us to be, then we have to wrestle with these questions, and then we have to answer them with every word that we speak and in every action of our lives. That is how we can follow this revolutionary Jesus. That is how we can be the church that God calls us to be. Is it hard? Yeah. I'm reminded as I read this gospel today of the line, you probably heard it before, but Jesus came to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. Is it hard? Absolutely. Which is why Robert Parham, he's the author of The Agenda, 8 Lessons from Luke, writes about this passage we have read today. Luke 4:18 through 19 is probably one of the most ignored, watered down, spiritualized, or glossed over texts in many pulpits, evading or emptying Jesus' first statement of his moral agenda. Whew. if we're going to wrestle with these questions, if we're going to be the church that God calls us to be, if we're to be the faithful that our baptism anoints us to be, then we cannot water down, spiritualize, gloss over, or ignore the words of today. We do it at our own peril. We do it at the peril of the strangers on the streets and the peril of our nation. Bishop Buddy, in 2020, at a convention, preached this. She said, "This moment is an opportune time for our nation and our species." And then she concluded, "I pray someday people will look back and say, this was the time when we finally dealt with some things." That was in 2020. This moment is an opportune time where we are being called to deal with some things. And there's no question that people will look back upon this moment. They will look at the church. They will look at you. They will look at me. They will look at our nation. And they will see. The question is, will they see whether we've dealt with things or not? Amen.